relationship between our countries moving forward.
中方
China will never accept America's meaningless criticisms. We must demand that the U.S. drop its frequent hegemonic actions of interfering in China's internal affairs. This old defect must be fixed. America's gross interference in China's internal affairs has triggered the righteous indignation of the Chinese people. And of course, we are firmly opposed to these actions. Although Anchorage is a halfway point between China and the US, it is still the US, and we accepted the US invitation to come here. But the day before we arrived, the US slapped new sanctions on China. I don't think this is the way you should normally treat a guest.
Meanwhile, a war of words has also escalated between the presidents of the United States and Russia. In a television interview this week, Joe Biden branded Vladimir Putin a killer. Mr. Putin has now hit back with a schoolyard chant that equates to "it takes one to know one." The Russian leader also challenged President Biden to talk to him live on air. Russia has recalled its ambassador to the US as the country prepares to be hit by a new round of sanctions over alleged election meddling. The civil disobedience movement is continuing across Myanmar despite security forces cracking down on demonstrators. Local media reports at least 7 people were injured and several protest leaders were arrested after police fired tear gas and bullets at crowds in the city of Angbang in central Myanmar. At least 224 people have died in the violent clashes since the military takeover more than 6 weeks ago. The head of the military junta has attended an online meeting with his counterparts from ASEAN, Association Southeast Asian Nations. Meanwhile, Indonesia's president is calling for a high-level meeting with other regional leaders.
Indonesia urges for dialogue, that reconciliation is carried out immediately to restore democracy, peace and stability in Myanmar. I will immediately call the Sultan of Brunei as head of ASEAN to as soon as possible hold a high-level ASEAN meeting to discuss the crisis in Myanmar.
And we'll have more on that situation in Myanmar with our Southeast Asia correspondent Mazoe Ford a little later. Parts of New South Wales are tonight being hit by some of the heaviest rainfall seen in a decade. Homes have been damaged by floods and landslides. Some residents have been ordered to evacuate and warned to brace for things to get even worse.
People and their pets are forced to flee to higher ground as evacuations gather pace at this caravan park in Nambucca Heads.
The wonderful SES have just rescued us all. Thanks, fellas.
Locals were left rattled by landslides.
Rumbling, loud, spooky. I'm so glad there was no cars. Someone would have been killed, I think.
Down the road, another landslip crashed into this home. With the owner away, neighbour Richard Boyle checked on the property to find a muddy mess.
She's devastated. She's just done a lot of work to the place. She made it a dream home. You know, her family comes and stays with her quite often. And it's just sad to see the extent of the damage.
SES volunteer Malcolm Smith was out on a job helping others when he was suddenly called back to his own home in Nelson Bay.
So the water's come from next door's property from up the hill. It's burst through there and just come through here like a river, roughly about that deep. And probably in line with that tabletop there, right through the house, around the house and then out the driveway.
His family spent the day assessing the damage.
It drenched the carpet, it drenched every single room in our house.
Residents have been filling sandbags to protect what they can.
This region faces a major task, not only cleaning up properties, but also repairing roads. It's only likely to be hampered by more rain expected over the weekend.
We are seeing very dangerous, potentially life-threatening rainfall on the mid-north coast.
The SES has responded to at least 2,000 calls for help across the state.
Stay out of floodwaters. If it's flooded, forget it. It's not worth the risk. Don't put your own lives, the lives of your family and the lives of the rescuers at unnecessary risk.
Residents on the central coast are hunkering down as the wild weather tracks south.
It's just rising and just basically stressing us out because we don't know whether we will get all that rain.
Wildlife hasn't been spared.
Just got into the water. Oh no.
But even the animals are finding ways to get by.
Come on, buddy.
Claudia Jambor, ABC News, Coffs Harbour.
And for the latest on this weather event, here's Emma Siossian in Port Macquarie.
This afternoon, residents in low-lying parts of Port Macquarie were ordered to try and evacuate by 8 p.m. tonight, or else risk becoming trapped and it becoming too dangerous for them to leave their homes. Since then, as you can see behind me, the Hastings River has breached its banks in a number of low-lying areas and has been rising quite rapidly over low-lying parkland and around some buildings, homes. Some roads are being closed. Residents further south of here, around Laurieton and Dumbogan, were also ordered to evacuate, with low-lying areas there also becoming inundated. And as the evenings progressed, some periods of intense rainfall and continuing rising river levels have brought further inundation across low-lying areas to the north of here. There have been evacuation orders around Maxville and also for a number of towns around the Lower Macleay near Kempsey, where residents there have been told to either leave their homes or they'll have to stay put. There is the chance that they could lose power or things like phone and internet. And of course the SES continuing to remind people not to try and drive through floodwaters.
Emma Siossian there. Australians are being assured the AstraZeneca vaccine is safe after regulators here and in Europe dismissed links between the British-made jab and blood clots. Now the rush is on to deliver supplies to doctors around the country ahead of the next stage of vaccination starting on Monday. Here's Andrew Green.
Well, look, thank you all very much for coming together today.
Primary healthcare begins with clear and comforting communication.
My primary message to all of you is thank you. My primary message is thank you for the work you've done to date.
The Prime Minister deploying his own bedside manner as he meets GPs who'll be charged with delivering the vaccines.
We're going into a very important week.
Frustrations over the pace of Australia's rollout continue. In Europe, there have been safety fears over possible links between the AstraZeneca vaccine and blood clots. But this country's pharmaceutical regulator insists it hasn't received any reports of blood clots following administration of the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine in Australia. We advise that people in Australia should continue to get the AstraZeneca vaccine when eligible.
Overall, the risk of clots is not increased by these vaccines, and that's what all the regulators are saying. Overall, there's actually no safety concerns.
Overnight, European authorities gave the green light to resume administering the British-developed product.
There is no increase in the overall risk of blood clots with this vaccine.
Italy was among the first to announce a resumption of the vaccine on a day of memorial for the more than 100,000 Italians who've died of COVID-19 so far. And in Britain, a Prime Minister who's had his own near-death experience will soon receive the homegrown vaccine.
So the Oxford jab is safe and the Pfizer jab is safe. The thing that isn't safe is catching COVID.
On Monday, the next stage of Australia's COVID-19 vaccination rollout begins. Phase 1B includes anyone over 70 years of age and others with certain medical conditions. But some of the GPs who'll be giving the doses are yet to receive them.
I've got a fridge, which is nice, but I'm still waiting for my vaccines.
A weekend of waiting ahead. Andrew Green, ABC News, Canberra.
Meanwhile, a worsening coronavirus crisis is playing out on Australia's doorstep with infections in PNG at a critical tipping point. Close to half of the people getting tested at the country's largest hospital are returning positive results, and infections are spreading throughout frontline health staff as well. PNG correspondent Natalie Whiting reports from Port Moresby.
On the streets of Port Moresby, there's no sign of a crisis. But the country's COVID-19 pandemic controller says things need to change.
What we're asking our people and those who call Papua New Guinea home is to change our mindset in terms of dealing with COVID-19.
As cases continue to soar, new restrictions are being introduced. From Monday, there will be caps on the number of people on public transport and on gatherings, along with limits on travel between provinces. Most businesses can keep functioning with slightly reduced hours. But this hotel has decided to close its restaurant.
We've seen a lot of businesses being shut down due to cases within their staff or outbreaks within their offices. So for us, we've kind of taken a conservative approach.
Schools will shut for 4 weeks and distance learning in PNG will be tough.
Maybe 4 weeks is good enough, not to go beyond. Let them go back to school and pick up from where they left off.
The growing risk of infection has led to a major mine suspending operations for a fortnight at an expected cost of more than $75 million. At the Port Moresby General Hospital, there are calls to do more to flatten the curve.
The public has to get on board.
42% of people tested for coronavirus here are coming back positive, including more than 100 workers. These tents from Australia will be used to separate possible COVID-19 patients.
Well, there's no other hospital the public can tend to, so by all means, we have to keep our doors open.
A record number of 6 positive cases from the country were detected in hotel quarantine in Queensland yesterday.
We have 9 new cases in hotel quarantine, and 6 of these cases are from Papua New Guinea.
8,000 vaccines from Australia for frontline workers are expected to arrive next week. But health officials are warning that isn't a silver bullet. Widespread misinformation and conspiracy theories about the virus and vaccines need to be overcome. And there are calls to better enforce measures already in place, like wearing a mask.
The message is going out on radio, TV, but people are not following. If they are not following, you need enforcement.
Authorities say discussions are underway with disciplinary forces and community volunteers about how best to do that. Natalie Whiting, ABC News, Port Moresby.
Well, let's head back to Alaska now, where officials from the US and China have held tense discussions. The two sides didn't hold back, taking aim at each other's policies at a time when relations were already rocky. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by co-host of the Little Red podcast and fellow at ANU's Department of Pacific Affairs, Graham Smith, live from Canberra. Graham, thanks very much for speaking with us this evening. Given the animosity between the US and China in recent years, how significant is it that this summit is even happening?
Look, I mean, that's on both sides. I think they're just happy that it's happening. They even were calling it different things. So China wanted to call this summit a strategic dialogue. The US are referring to it as a one-off. But either way, the fact that it's happening at all, despite all the heated words, is a success in itself.
As we saw earlier in the bulletin, it was a pretty rough opening day with some severe accusations being levelled at one another in front of the press for over an hour. Given how low the US-China relationship sank under Donald Trump, is this a sign for it to go even lower, or is it the first step towards some kind of reconciliation, some kind of healing?
Look, I think in some ways both sides have so many red lines that it was probably good for them to get it out of their system. I think they clearly needed to get it out of their system. I mean, the thing was only meant to last a couple of minutes on each side, and then they would go away for closed-door negotiations. And as you said, it lasted for over an hour and a half, with the US accusing the Chinese side of grandstanding, and China covering everything from America as sort of the champion cyber attacker to the Black Lives Matter movement. So, yeah, it certainly wasn't as planned, but the behind closed doors thing went on, and from all accounts was very successful. So, yeah, it was a big show for domestic audiences both in the US and China, I think. So is there a cause for optimism here at all? Do you see any areas where either side might be willing to cede some sort of ground? Look, I think that's what the hope is in the future. There will be other meetings, of course, and to a certain extent, the meetings have to be at the top level between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden. That's what both sides are clearly kind of working towards. And there are areas, both sides signalled there are areas they're willing to cooperate on, the most obvious being climate change. So I think in areas where there is not direct competition, you will see the Biden administration being more willing to accommodate reasonable demands from the Chinese side. Now, earlier this week, Joe Biden's Indo-Pacific coordinator, Kurt Campbell, said that the US wasn't going to leave Australia alone on the field. Those were his words. Do you think that the US will succeed in convincing China to back off on some of its damaging economic policies towards Australia? Well, look, there's no doubt if you look at the US opening statement, we've made the top line. So in their opening statement, they covered off Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Taiwan, and economic coercion against US allies. No mention of the South China Sea, which you would have thought would have been a first-order concern. So we're definitely in the top league. The significance is, will this lead to us being beaten over the head even more? It's very, very hard to say. But it is a huge change from the Trump administration. the word allies and alliances was used no fewer than 9 times during the address. And in a way, a lot of the economic punishment that we've seen meted out to Australia is a direct result of the Trump administration's trade deal with China. So, for example, beef or barley, they were basically punishments given to us to make room for US exports to China. So it's a huge change from the previous administration. So it will benefit us, but who knows in what ways.
Well, just on that point, could it go the other way? Could China react badly to some of what the US is trying to do here and seek to punish Australia even further?
Look, that's entirely possible. And the US side were very careful not to mention individual allies that it had in mind when it came to economic coercion. But Yang Jiechi, towards the end of his final address, named us as one company or one country that he didn't see as having any grounds to be complaining.
Wow. Graham Smith, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
In the wake of the Atlanta shooting, people across America are protesting violence against Asian Americans. 8 people died in the Georgia shooting spree, 6 of whom were Asian women. Protesters want the shooting to be labelled as a hate crime. Talia Olatia reports.
76-year-old Xiao Zhenzi from China was waiting to cross the street in downtown San Francisco when she was punched in the face in an unprovoked attack. Ms. Z fought back. As the suspect, Stephen Jenkins, laid on a hospital stretcher, she asked him in Cantonese, "Why did you hit me?" Jenkins had also assaulted an 83-year-old Asian man that day. Why is the question so many are asking following the Georgia shootings. In Minnesota, people marched in solidarity with the Asian community. And in Atlanta, where the shootings took place, Korean community leaders met.
Hate crimes and the stupid, unnecessary killing. We need to stop here.
Authorities have not classified the Spa killings as a hate crime.
We don't need anyone to tell us that we don't know if it was racially motivated or not. We can see with our own eyes that this was a hate crime. And anyone who says otherwise is a coward and refuses to believe the truth.
While the motive of the killings remains under investigation, Asian American faith leaders are calling for action beyond prayers.
It's time for us to step up and voice and stand up together to change this world of violence and hatred.
The Centre for the Study of Hate and Extremism says hate crimes against Asian Americans during 2020 more than doubled. Many link the surge to the coronavirus rhetoric. 2 days after the Georgia shootings, a US congressional hearing looked into the rise of anti-Asian violence.
The assailant did this heinous act because he thought the family was Chinese and infecting people with the coronavirus. He thought the family was Chinese and they were infecting people with the coronavirus. Take your heads out of the sand. Where is the dignity?
While we wait for answers to these questions, police are stepping up their patrols in Asian American communities. Talia Olatia, ABC News.
Samia Suluhu Hassan has become the first female president of Tanzania. The former vice president was sworn in at State House in the country's former capital, Dar es Salaam. Hassan assumes the presidency after the death of John Magufuli, who had been absent from public life for the past 2 weeks. Federal police have launched an investigation into a former Australian Air Force pilot implicated in a failed plot to overthrow a foreign government. A new UN report describes the Libyan mission as a well-funded private military company operation and accuses 2 other Australians of being involved. Dylan Welch from ABC Investigations with this exclusive report.
Under cover of dark, the mercenaries fled Libya after their plan to help a warlord overthrow the government fell apart. Now, with the release of a UN report, their secret mission has been dragged into the sunlight.
I've been involved with seaplanes in Canada, in America.
The man the UN alleges oversaw the operation is former Australian fighter pilot Christian Serge Durant. The ABC can reveal that the Australian Federal Police are now also investigating Durant over the operation.
It's always very serious if any Australian military personnel is charged
as a mercenary because it breaks down the commitment of Australia to meet its international obligations.
A panel of investigators working for the UN Security Council have spent more than a year uncovering evidence in the case. This week, they released the results. Durant and 2 other Australian men were named.
It's extremely troubling if Australians are being named in a report that alleges, widespread laws of war violations.
The UN investigators found that Durant breached a Libyan arms embargo and he now risks being slapped with a travel ban and the freezing of his assets.
Anyone that breaks a UN embargo is really diminishing Australia in the eyes of the world, in my view.
Last year, Four Corners revealed documents outlining the role of Durant and others in the operation, which among other things involved him sending a group of seasoned mercenaries to Libya to run a kill-capture program targeting important opponents of warlord Khalifa Haftar.
We are extremely troubled by these allegations, and we think that there needs to be full investigations with a view to prosecutions of anyone who is involved in laws of war violations in Libya.
In a statement to Four Corners last year, Durant rejected the UN findings, saying the operation was for the oil and gas industry and not military in nature. Dylan Welch, ABC News.
Let's head back to the ongoing crisis in Myanmar, and Indonesia has added its name to those calling for democracy to be restored after a violent military coup began weeks ago. Meanwhile, Southeast Asia correspondent Mazoe Ford says the list of charges laid against deposed leader Aung San Suu Kyi continues to grow.
Well, Manny, the new allegations come from a property developer and a convicted drug trafficker called Mong Wai-ik in Myanmar. He went on state-run television with his allegations. He said that between 2018 and 2020, when Aung San Suu Kyi was in government, he gave her 4 payments in black envelopes worth the equivalent of 700,000 Australian dollars. And these allegations come on top of other allegations last week by Myanmar's military junta that Aung San Suu Kyi had received other illegal payments worth close to 800,000 Australian dollars, as well as some gold bars. So these are the most serious accusations to be levelled against the ousted leader of Myanmar, yet if she is convicted of these down the track, she could face a lengthy prison term and would be prevented from running for political office in the future. There are some other charges as well, the illegal importation of 6 walkie-talkies, breaching coronavirus restrictions and allegedly spreading information that may cause fear or alarm. But certainly these allegations of accepting illegal payments, many are the most serious yet.
Now, authorities are also planning to put additional restrictions on internet services there. Why is that, and what impact is that having?
It's already having a massive impact, Manny. Every night the internet is out in Myanmar for differing periods of time, so that is having a huge impact there. Initially, the junta said it was to stop the spread of what it called fake news, and they stopped the internet for safety reasons. But lately, there hasn't really been any clear explanation. This is having a huge effect on the generation that really grew up with a 4G connection to the world, the young generation that didn't suffer the isolation that their parents or grandparents' generations had. They've lost that connection to the world for large parts of the day. It's also having a big effect on businesses, language schools, organisations, people right across the country who have lost that connection to each other and to the outside world.
Meanwhile, Mazoe, lawmakers are exploring whether the International Criminal Court can investigate crimes against humanity since Myanmar's military coup began. Given the rising death toll, how strong would their case be?
You'd have to think it would be very strong, Manny. 220 people have been killed, and that number is climbing by the day. There are also hundreds of people who have been injured. So these ousted lawmakers are looking into whether the International Criminal Court could investigate whether there have been crimes against humanity. They're looking at just how they can hold the junta and their foot soldiers accountable, because as we have seen, there have been protests every day right across Myanmar, mostly peaceful protests, and yet we are seeing this bloodshed on the streets every single day, and that death toll and injury toll continues to rise.
Mazoe Ford, thank you. A Taliban negotiator has told a peace conference in Moscow that it's time for US troops to leave Afghanistan. Suhail Shaheen called on America to comply with the agreed-upon date, May 1st, for their final withdrawal from the country. The US invaded Afghanistan in 2001, making the 20-year war America's longest conflict. Mr. Shaheen said failure to leave would draw a reaction.
They should go, because if they do not go at the end of April, that means they continue. After that, it will be a kind of a violation of the agreement. That violation would not be from our side, but it would be from their side. So in that case, if there is action, of course there will be reaction. The violation will have reaction. But we hope that this should not happen.
NASA has completed an 8-minute test of engines on a Boeing-built rocket for Artemis missions that aim to return astronauts to the moon. The 4 engines roared to life for the full duration of the test, filling the surrounding areas with clouds of white smoke. A previous test in January ended after about a minute, while well short of the roughly 4-minute engineers needed to gather enough data. NASA aims to return astronauts to the moon by 2024, but the program is 3 years behind schedule and several $1 billion over budget. 2-1 in the world now, and how far would you go for a free meal? Well, a dozen people in Taiwan have gone to extreme lengths by changing their name to Salmon to qualify for a 2-day sushi restaurant promotion. Seafood-loving customers with the name were promised a free meal, while those who had similar-sounding names enjoyed a half-priced meal. Local media has branded the craze Salmon Chaos, with some people eating hundreds of dollars worth of food. Taiwan allows people to officially change their name up to 3 times, but after a surge in applications, the Taiwanese government is urging people to think carefully about changing their name to Salmon and back. You're watching The World. The top stories we're following tonight. Residents on New South Wales' mid-north coast evacuate their homes as the region is hit by heavy rains. US and Chinese diplomats trade angry words during the first high-level talks between the two countries under the Biden administration. And Indonesian President Joko Widodo calls for an emergency meeting of his Southeast Asian counterparts to address the violence in Myanmar. Well, let's return to that fiery first meeting between the Biden administration and senior Chinese government officials in Alaska, where talks exposed their sharp differences and bristling tensions. Both sides ripped up protocol by exchanging barbs over human rights, foreign interference, and Beijing's economic cold shoulder towards Australia. Here's correspondent Greg Jennett.
The snap-frozen strands of a crumpled red carpet led the way.
Thank you very much for making the journey to meet with us.
To the Alaskan chamber of cryogenic diplomacy.
We do not seek conflict, but we welcome stiff competition.
There is no way to strangle China.
A 30-minute Chinese diatribe.
You can't blame this problem on somebody else.
Soon turned frosty talks to white-hot anger.
Hold on 1 second, please.
Team USA wouldn't leave unanswered accusations it interferes in China.
It's not lectures or long, winding statements.
Scripts were scrapped and terse words tossed freely.
China urges the U.S. side to fully abandon the hegemonic practice of willfully interfering in China's internal affairs.
I'm also hearing deep concern about some of the actions your government is taking.
Top-level talks haven't happened for a while, and there's no haste by the U.S. to resume either. Not until it's satisfied security clampdowns in Hong Kong are halted, designs on Taiwan and the South China Sea are relinquished, and cyber espionage abandoned. US officials involved in setting up these talks aren't raising any expectations of immediate breakthroughs or concessions. In fact, tensions and sanctions could go up before they come down. And Australia's problems with Beijing won't be ignored either. Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan are reminding the Chinese delegation they take economic coercion of a junior ally as seriously as if it were inflicted on America itself.
China's relationship with the United States, with Japan, and with Australia, I don't think we should lump them all just easily together to accuse China of coercion. Who is coercing whom?
And these were just the bits the public was meant to see. The rest runs for hours in icy isolation. Greg Jennett, ABC News, Washington.
The Chinese trial for one of the two Canadian businessmen accused of spying has ended without a verdict. Michael Spavor has been detained in Beijing for more than 2 years with former Canadian diplomat Michael Kovrig. Officials were denied access to Mr Spavor's hearing, ramping up tensions between the two countries.
The trial is now concluded. There's been no pronouncement of a verdict. So that leaves it remains unclear what has transpired in the courtroom, and we remain frustrated about that. But then, nonetheless, we will continue to work diligently for the immediate release of Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, whose hearing will be on Monday in Beijing.
Health workers in Papua New Guinea say enforcement of COVID-19 prevention measures is needed to try to stem the high transmission rate. Coronavirus cases in the country are continuing to surge and health workers are continuing to be affected. The country's only psychiatric hospital is being locked down for a fortnight after 2 staff members tested positive. The CEO of the Port Moresby General Hospital, Dr Paki Malumi, says measures in place like mask wearing and social distancing aren't being followed.
In the last 14 days, 15 days in the month of March, we had increased number of cases, both staff and patients, with positivity rate of 41%. So of those, we had about 115 of our staff that came back positive, both nurses, a few doctors, and mostly nurses. So we've isolated them. Almost a third of them have returned to work after being cleared for 2 weeks. So that's what we are doing to maintain the staff to continue service at the hospital. Those who recover come back to work. Fortunately, most of them been asymptomatic or in the mild category. Well, the message is going out, but the question is whether the public is following those COVID protocols. You know, in PNG, we live in communities, we live in groups, and social distance is very difficult in such. And people may be wearing masks and hand sanitizing in public. Of course, the business houses are doing very well, trying to ensure that everyone that enters the premises have masks and hand sanitizing. But once you get out and into the settlements and into the villages, is it really followed is the question, and definitely not. And that is our big worry, that the virus will continue to spread in that kind of environment.
Returning to Europe now, and concerns around a possible link between the AstraZeneca vaccine and blood clots continue to circulate. More and more countries adding to the list of those suspending their rollout of the vaccine. Our Europe correspondent Nick Doll is in London and he joins me now live. Nick, more than a dozen European countries suspended their immunisation drives due to the blood clot concerns. Why the change of heart?
Well, these countries have now taken their cue from the European Medicines Agency, the medicines regulator here, which has found quite conclusively that the AstraZeneca vaccine is both safe and effective. They'd always said that the benefits outweighed any potential risks, but of course they did have to look into these unconfirmed reports about blood clotting in patients who had been given this vaccine. They found that there was no evidence that there is a link, but they couldn't conclusively prove that there wasn't. So they have suggested that more warnings be put on the labels, that patients be made aware of the potential risk of blood clotting, and their doctors as well. But overwhelmingly, the view of the EMA was that this should continue right across Europe and the world, because really the risks of dying of COVID are far, far greater than they are of getting any blood clots, if that link exists at all.
Now, how significant is this decision? What will this mean for trying to curb coronavirus numbers across Europe?
Well, it will be very important because it opens up another vaccine for use. The Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine is one of 4 that are currently being rolled out across much of Europe. At the moment, it's the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine that's doing most of the heavy lifting. I think the question, though, is how much damage will be done as a result of this suspension and as a result of some of these warnings, because even though the vaccine is now approved and given the green light, a lot of people will be concerned, and this will only add to quite a lot of scepticism that we've already seen in Europe. There had been quite a lot of questions raised about the efficacy and the safety of the AstraZeneca vaccine previously, and that wasn't helped by comments from leaders like Emmanuel Macron, the French president, who described it as being quasi-effective for use in older age groups. That was later found to be quite untrue. So I think there will be quite a lot of resistance still to this vaccine, but obviously having it be formally endorsed by regulators hopefully will give people a little more confidence and speed up the otherwise fairly sluggish rollout of the vaccine across Europe.
Now, despite the AstraZeneca approval, Britain will now be slowing down its rollout due to supply issues.
That's right. One of the few bright spots of the UK's response to the coronavirus has been the vaccine rollout. It really has been a huge success up until this point, and more than 25 million people here have already had a first dose. But the government here has announced there will be a slowdown. There is a supply issue over AstraZeneca. Basically, there's 5 million doses that have been held up from a lab in India, which won't be coming the UK's way. So even though there has been tremendous progress up until now, things will have to slow down. That really raises the question, will the UK still be able to lift its lockdowns in the time frame that it's set out? The Prime Minister Boris Johnson says the answer is definitely yes. So even though there will be a slowdown, they think they can still meet their immunisation targets. What will make things potentially more serious for the UK is that Europe, of course, has threatened to stop exports of the AstraZeneca vaccine to the UK. The EU says it's not getting enough vaccine from the UK, so it might stop its supplies heading over the channel. So that potentially could cause supply risks down the track. But for now, things are on track in the UK. And the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is due to get his vaccine today, and he insists it will be the AstraZeneca one that he'll be getting.
And moving on to France, Nick, the French capital is set to go into a month-long lockdown as fears of a third wave continue to grow.
That's right. There's a serious coronavirus issue continuing in France, and there's roughly 20,000 cases a day that we're seeing, 300-400 deaths a day. So very serious indeed. Intensive care units once again are reporting significant pressure. So large parts of the country, including the capital, will be subjected to a harsher lockdown. That'll mean that people can't travel as easily. They'll have to stay closer to home. They will still be able to go and exercise. They'll be able to do some shopping, but only essential retail. And schools for now will remain open as well. But really, the government says that this is essential if they're going to escape the grips of what it's calling a third wave, because as we've spoken about, the vaccination program there has been quite slow, and it's not doing anywhere near the heavy lifting that it is in countries like the UK.
Nick Dole reporting there from London. A shipment of Pfizer vaccines destined for South Australia has been wrongly delivered to Western Australia. It isn't yet clear how the bungle happened, but it's delayed the rollout of the vaccine in SA's aged care homes. The Federal Health Department wouldn't say how many doses were in the shipment or what's happened to them. Isabel Damon reports.
Many SA aged care residents are now due to receive their second Pfizer jab, but today's shipment ended up more than 2,500 kilometres away from its delivery address.
We simply can't continue to see this chaos continue with the vaccine rollout already so far behind schedule.
Logistics and transport company DHL is in charge of storing and distributing the Pfizer vaccine, which has to be kept at temperatures below -70 degrees. The company didn't respond by deadline to the ABC's request for comment.
As we've seen aged care residents and staff left high and dry as the Morrison government sent their vaccines not just to another facility but to entirely another state.
It isn't clear how the shipment meant for Adelaide ended up in Perth.
I don't have the information on that particular shipment. The logistics, the procurement and the approval and the distribution of the vaccines is the responsibility of the federal government.
Parts of the rollout being managed by the state government are unaffected, including for frontline health workers. The Premier confident the program's on track overall.
There have been lots and lots of opportunities that have been created with the AstraZeneca vaccine, far easier from a logistics perspective.
The logistics bungle has been described by the Federal Health Department as a change in schedule. It says only a small number of aged care facilities have been affected. Isabel Damon, ABC News, Adelaide.
Bushfires are continuing to spread in northeastern Mexico after firefighting efforts were suspended due to bad weather. High temperatures and strong winds are stoking the flames, making it difficult to get the fire under control. At least 70 families have been evacuated and a dozen cabins have been destroyed. A series of severe storms and tornadoes have left a trail of destruction across parts of the United States. The wild weather damaged homes, knocked down trees and toppled power lines in Alabama and Mississippi. No injuries have been reported. The storm system is now moving across the southeast, threatening northern Florida, southern Georgia and the Carolinas. A mice plague overwhelming large parts of inland New South Wales is showing no signs of subsiding. Thousands of rodents are causing millions in damage.
Nav Singh's Galargambone supermarket is busier than usual. Not a customer in sight, but plenty of rodents. Most of his produce is in plastic tubs or tubs of water. Not even the toilet paper is safe.
The milk, which is in plastic, then in a box. They ate through the box and then into the plastic of the milk.
He's lost $30,000 worth of stock. It's the same problem in Cafe 2828.
Had first-hand some customers that saw a mouse run on the floor who left halfway through a meal, which crushed me.
Pest populations have drastically increased, and so have reports of them ruining crops, invading grain silos, sheds and homes. Farmers are spending thousands on poison, but it's making little difference. This mice plague brings with it dangers. 3 hospital patients have been bitten in Walgett, Coonamble and here in Galargambone. One person contracted a rare mouse-related disease which can be fatal. Health officials say they're surprised there haven't been more mouse-related illnesses contracted around the region.
I was on my iPod watching TikTok and one came up and bit me. And then when I looked, it just went flat out.
Local MP Roy Butler is calling for government support. He says farmers were enjoying their first drought-free season and now face financial ruin.
This could go on until we get either a stack of rain or very cold weather, so the first frost. That could still be 2 months away. And keep in mind, some people have been battling these mice for 6 months.
It's a plague that shows no sign of abating. Lucy Thackeray, ABC News, Galargambone.
The World Health Organization has released its first report on the issue of ageism, revealing just how prevalent it is. The survey of more than 80,000 people found 1 in 2 still hold moderate to highly ageist attitudes, and it's taken a devastating toll on many elderly people during the pandemic.
When artist Sally Rees began preparing for her latest exhibition, she was also preparing to turn 50.
I wanted to feel proud of it and I wanted it to be something for people to look forward to.
She's putting together a video installation about women as they age for Hobart's Museum of Old and New Art. She's become increasingly aware that for many, getting older is a frightening prospect.
I was also reading a lot of statistics in the news about how this demographic of older women in Australia was the largest growing demographic of homelessness. It was the largest growing demographic of people signing on to Newstart.
The World Health Organization has released its first report on ageism.
COVID-19 has unveiled just how widespread ageism is in our society.
A survey of 83,000 people from 57 countries found 1 in every 2 people held moderately or highly ageist attitudes. In Europe, 1 in 3 older people report being the target of ageism.
Unfortunately, we were not shocked at the prevalence.
The report found age discrimination within healthcare is widespread. The decision not to ventilate a patient increased 15% for each decade. For surgery, it was 19%.
It has negative consequences on our physical and our mental health. It reduces our longevity. It reduces our quality of life.
The report also highlights the cost of ageism. A study found that in Australia, if 5% more people over the age of 55 were employed, the country would be $48 billion better off. Improved contact between young and old is seen as one way to tackle the issue. In Melbourne, this park is designed to encourage older people to exercise near a children's playground.
It's a core role of government. Older people are part of our community, and we need to provide infrastructure and services to them.
Providing simple solutions to age-old problems. Fiona Blackwood, ABC News.
To the AFL now, and the Friday night round